Hello and welcome to Policy Watch, your packed snapshot of the week's biggest business stories, their context, their relevance and impact. I'm Govindraj, Ethiraj. The falling ruble is rapidly becoming a cause for concern not just for the Russian public and its President Vladimir Putin, but also for the world economy. This week it forced Putin to come out strongly to defend his actions on Ukraine that invited US sanctions. The sanctions are just one of the many reasons responsible for Russia's economic problems. However, the re-election of Shinzo Abe in Japan and revival of the US economy are some of the bright spots in the world economy. Here's a report.
A steep 16% fall in the Russian ruble has become the latest nightmare for the world economy. On Tuesday, Russia's currency depreciated 20% against the US dollar. The central bank increased interest rates from 10.5% to 17%. It also put $80 billion in the currency market to arrest the ruble's fall. But the measures didn't have the desired impact. A slide started after crude oil prices were cut drastically over the last 1 year, in part due to the sanctions that the West imposed on Russia for its role in the Ukrainian crisis.
Russia, of course, is very deeply exposed to the commodity cycle, and as we all know, oil prices have declined very dramatically and overall commodities have also declined. So as a result of that, and in addition to that, the sanctions that Russia is uniquely facing have created a very difficult situation for them.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has pledged to revive the Russian economy in the next 2 years. Last week, Putin came to India for a bilateral summit when he pushed for trade being conducted in local currency. Which is why India is keeping a close watch on Russia and what the development could mean for emerging economies. In October, the IMF's World Outlook scaled down global GDP growth projections to 3.3%. That is 0.4% less than its earlier projection in April.
Конечно, сегодняшняя ситуация спровоцирована внешними факторами прежде всего. Но исходим из того, что нами многое не сделано из того, что мы планировали сделать и говорили о том, что мы должны сделать по диверсификации нашей экономики в течение практически предыдущих 20 лет.
The IMF also projected a minor uptick for the Indian economy, but warned that the crisis in Russia, Brazil and emerging economies could play spoiler. However, the re-election of Shinzo Abe in Japan and revival of the US economy are a few bright spots for the world economy.
Well, joining me now to understand the impact of the ruble crisis and more importantly to ask what this could mean for India and India's economy, I'm joined by Jamal Mecklai, CEO of Mecklai Financials, and Sujan, Hajra, Chief Economist at Anand, Rathi. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining with us. Sujan, let me begin with you. How do you see it as an economist?
See, obviously, Russia is a major country, and a crisis in Russia will have global implication and it will have contagion. Now, rather than the direct impact, I think it's more the sentimental impact which will happen. And say, one of the major reasons for the Russian crisis is the falling oil prices, which in itself is good for India. But at the same time, since it increases investor risk aversion, so the cross-border flows get impacted for India. So given the current situation, when on the one hand Fed is going to tighten the rates, Europe, Japan, China are slowing down, the Russian crisis obviously is sort of a situation which is worsening the case, particularly in terms of sentiment.
Okay. Jamal, let me come to you. Is this, I mean, obviously this has been triggered by oil, but this seems to have had a significant impact on currency. And not just the Russian currency, even the Indian currency, whether connected to it or not, has been depreciating.
Well, you know, I mean, basically, if we talk in a very narrow way about the Indian currency, since May, since the election, you know, the rupee, there has been money coming in, and despite the fact that the dollar was strengthening globally, the rupee was not weakening, right? So little by little, the rupee had got somewhat overvalued, quite a bit, in fact, 8 or 9% in my view. So in that sort of environment, whenever there is any sort of major global crisis, as Sujan just said, you know, the contagion effect pushed the rupee dramatically lower, right? Now, the good news is that with Dr. Rajan there, the market respects him. So when they came in and intervened earlier this week, it was, I think, enough to hold it back for a bit. But I think that, I don't think the party's over, because oil is going to remain low, I believe, for a long time. And the impact of that is going to be widespread across the world. Russia is obviously one of the worst, hardest hit, because it came when they were grappling with sanctions. And one thing I'm a little surprised at, that I haven't heard anybody talk about, is I would expect, I don't have any details, but I would expect that there would be a lot of European banks who have exposures to Russia. I mean, American banks don't have such significant exposures to Russia.
Right. Okay, Sujan, let me come to you. So there was BRIC at once upon a time, and we're effectively saying now it's India and China too is slowing. India, of course, is slow, but maybe things will pick up. So what does this mean overall? I mean, is it a global problem that we are now facing the consequences of, or is it only confined to, let's say, the 2 or 3 countries which have been most hit by the oil price fall?
See, if you look at the basic terminology for BRICS, it came at a particular global situation. These countries were doing well. Now, obviously, if you see the nature of the country, these economies, they are pretty different. Particularly, on the one hand, Brazil and Russia, they are more of commodity exporters. Whereas if you look at China, it's mostly an investment story, export story. For India, it's more of a domestic demand story. So it's at certain point of time, all 4 countries are growing, and they are clubbed together in the sense they are also pretty large by the emerging market size. China obviously in absolute size as well. So I don't think it meant that these economies will grow in the same rate, or their path of development will be the same. At the same time, if you see today certain other countries, for example, if you look at Indonesia, or if you look at Turkey, or if you look at South Africa, some of these countries are also coming into, you are talking about BRICS, you included South Africa also.
Yes.
So my sense is that what is happening in the globally, the growth is going to be extremely asynchronous, and the investor will also be extremely discriminating among the emerging market countries. I think the biggest thing for any country, whether that country has the mandate to reform, and they can quickly react to the changing global situation, those are the countries which will stand out.
So you're saying growth will be asynchronous, but that means some countries will continue to grow and others may not, which is obviously quite evident.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay, so the next question is, what is the lesson in this for India? So this is something that we were not prepared for, right? We were maybe not sure whether we would grow as an economy, but we were not knowing that oil prices will fall, which we will benefit from, but currency will also fall quite sharply, which only part of the economy will benefit from.
Yeah, in fact, if you look at India's external liability, which is to in excess of $400 billion, and so from that perspective, weaker rupee actually negatively impacts the economy to a large extent. Now, having said that, see, there are, as you rightly said, the impact across sectors are very different. The impact on pharma or IT is very different from consumer goods. But the broad trend is that, given that India's resilience in terms of domestic consumption, I don't think impact of this will be large. The oil price fall obviously is a major boost for India, but the reason why oil price is falling, is it falling because of increased supply, which is good, and is it falling because globally there is no demand, which is bad, because if the global economy is slowing, that cannot be good for India.
Right. Okay, so that's a good point. So let me come back to you, Jamal. You know, the Central Bank of Russia increased interest rates from 10.5 to 17%, put 80 billion dollars in the currency market to arrest the ruble. So obviously it's a crisis-like situation there. What does this mean for us? I mean, sitting here, what can we take away from this in order to ensure, or at least anticipate, something similar happening?
Well, I don't think we're anywhere near the same position, And I think, as Dr. Rajan has said several times, look, there are lots of things in the world you can't do anything about, right? Fed raises interest rates, a European bank goes bust, right? You can't really do anything about those things. All you can do is keep your nose down and build your internal strength. I think he's done a pretty good job as far as the monetary policy side goes. The government, the government. It's trying, but it's grappling with lots of problems. A lot of people, I think, are sort of impatient that they've not really gotten away from the populist side. I mean, the deficit is still a major issue. But I think with little time, we will get stronger. So little by little, I think we will be able to weather the situation. I don't think, in fact, I think we've done reasonably well. The rupee hasn't really collapsed, right? It's fallen a few rupees, which is nothing serious. I think that what we've got to do is keep getting our internals stronger. We should be doing something more sensible with gold. We should be deregulating the market some more. And I think all these things will hopefully come in the next year.
So one is to say, the way you say it, that keep your nose down, focused and so on. But are there steps that we should be taking from a policy standpoint which should some way ensure that we don't get affected by the headwinds or tailwinds that are currently sort of buffeting all these economies?
No, I mean, there's nothing we can do, right? I mean, I think in point of fact, I think we should globalize ourselves more. For example, I think the currency market should be deregulated. See, if you have a larger and deeper market, right, the average volatility will be higher, which means more companies will hedge. See, one of the problems we face is whenever the rupee gets quiet, importers don't hedge. And then when something happens, oh God, the world is falling apart. So you need a more mature market, and more mature market behavior that will only come if the average volatility goes up. And if the average volatility, only with the average volatility will go up if the market gets more deeper and broader. So that's one policy direction I think we need to go in.
Right. Let me ask you this question. So if assuming we integrate more with the global economy, as Jamal says, would you see it as a risk, Sujan, or is that something that is perhaps the only way out to prevent any further problems from happening?
See, by integration, for example, if you just go back in the mid-90s, everybody was talking about capital account convertibility. That was the thing to do, and then the IMF was thinking of making it a part of the Articles of Agreement. But what happened thereafter in the East Asia? Nobody talks about that any longer. So when you are talking about integration, there obviously you have to be integrated. In this world, you cannot remain isolated. But
at this point of time, is our current level of integration fine for weathering this situation in the global markets? Should it be more? Should it be less?
No, I'll give you one concrete example. Say, for example, if you look at gold imports. Now, obviously, we had this 2080 norm. As soon as the norm went out, you had almost $10 billion worth of gold import. India's trade deficit widened, India's current account deficit widened. A part of the depreciation of rupee can be attributed to that. So obviously there will be certain kind of hiccup, but at the same time, if you keep gold restricted, you also know that the smuggling of gold is increasing. So you always have a cost if you try to keep the economic closed. So I think the way forward is obviously to open up more. But having said that, you have to keep
calibrated
and certain kind of supervision also.
Okay, which we are doing in any case. Jamal, last question, and very quickly, where do you see the rupee going?
I have no idea. I think that broadly, like I said, I think it's still a little bit overvalued, and I think that right now global markets are still pretty rocky. People are now looking at US rates going up. So I'm not sure that we're going to see the kind of dramatic inflows that we have seen. I mean, they may be a little bit less, which suggests that probably while inflation has come down, I don't think it's going to stay down. I think the rupee will probably slide a little bit over the next year.
Sujan, how's your sense of the economy? I mean, we've been talking about a projection which is 6.5% average growth for the next 5 years. Do you see those figures roughly staying, considering oil prices have come down since all those projections were made, plus this new prices?
My sense is that if you are talking about average for the next 5 years, it will be plus 7%, if not 7.5%, 8%. And I think the bigger...
That's quite optimistic, I mean, compared to a lot of others,
obviously. And but I think the bigger thing is more on the inflation side. I would expect the average inflation to be around 4 to 5%, both WPI and CPI in the next 3 to 5 years, which will be far more conducive of pursuing a neutral monetary policy. So therefore lower interest rate. kickstarting of another capex cycle, and that's where the growth will come from. That's why I think my growth estimate is significantly better, higher than the consensus. So I won't be worrying too much. This kind of hiccups will always come.
But you're saying we can sort of absorb it and then we can move on.
Withstand it.
Right. That's a good note to end on. Thank you so much, Sujan. Thank you, Jamal. That's all we have time here. We will be back on the other side where we will talk about the challenges faced by the aviation sector and what policy intervention could be there for that. Stay with us. Welcome back to Policy Watch. The problems faced by private airlines like SpiceJet hit headlines earlier this week. The financial crisis in the company resulted in hardships for passengers and, more importantly, underscoring the challenges faced by the aviation sector. The vulnerabilities of the Indian aviation sector were exposed once again this week. This time it was leading domestic carrier SpiceJet, whose financial problems reached tipping point. Running up losses of over 2,194 crore rupees in 7 years since 2006, its total debt on March 2014 stood at 1,738 crore rupees. Lack of working capital forced the company to cancel dozens of flights, and the plight of the stranded passengers forced the regulator DGCA to cancel all slots allotted to SpiceJet then. Initially, the government refused to bail out the company, but it later changed its mind and allowed public sector banks to provide working capital loans. Aviation turbine fuel companies also agreed to refuel aircraft on cash payments. The travails of SpiceJet were another reminder of the ugly truth about the challenges faced by the sector. United Bank of India declared Vijay Mallya-led Kingfisher a willful defaulter in September. There were also media reports about a leading airline offering a 25% salary cut to staff in October when they met the management about delayed salary payments. Well, joining me here now in the studio to discuss this issue and look at what the future policy outcome ought to be is Jitendra, Bhargava, former Air India Executive Director and author of the book Descent of Air India. I'm also joined by Sanat Kaul, Chairman, International Foundation for Aviation and Development, and also a member of the ICO and former Joint Secretary, Civil Aviation. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. So let me begin with you, Mr. Kaul. What we are trying to understand is there a fundamental problem with the environment which is causing airlines, earlier Kingfisher, now SpiceJet, and others who are facing pressure to fall into this sort of trap, so to speak? Or is it a problem of maybe poor management and badly run companies?
No, I think it's a bit of both, in the sense that at one end, the airlines have to fend for themselves, and this is the private airlines, and therefore over competition at time, dropping prices, predatory pricing, excessive pricing, all that is not really helping them. They are down with $10.6 billion of losses over the last 7 years. The other side is about 45% of the operating costs is based on taxes, high ATF charges, etc., which is well known. So between the two, the airline industry is really reeling, and there is a need to review the basis on which this industry is going to survive or to thrive, because we don't want an ailing industry. Aviation is a very important transport sector and it must remain healthy.
Right. Mr. Bhargava, from your own experience in Air India, so Air India is a government owned organization, and obviously it gets a lot of government support, yet it faces a lot of problems. But again, what is the gap here? Why is it that all airlines, whether it's Air India, private airlines, land up in a position, and is management the issue, or is it the environment itself?
See, let me preface it by certain basic fundamentals. India aspires to be the third largest aviation industry in the world after USA and China by 2020. The government has a mistaken notion that it is sheer number of passengers that determine the size or the ranking of an industry. As a consequence, basic fundamental policy issues have been overlooked. If you go back 15 years ago, whenever there was a problem with Air India, dubbed as government airline, union controlled, low productivity, etc., and the systemic weaknesses of the airline industry were overlooked. Then came the private
Give
sector.
me one example.
Like came the systemic weaknesses, the high cost, high ATF cost, all these things have been prevalent from the days when Air India and Indian Airlines were the sole airlines operating in the country. Now, when you had, and that was the time when media and everybody was crying for privatization and saying you must have professionally managed Air India and Indian Airlines. Now you've had, for the last 15, 18 years, professionally managed private sector airlines. Kingfisher folded 2 years ago. SpiceJet is at the threshold or brink of collapsing, let's put it this way, if fresh funds don't come in. Now you have to look at the basic weaknesses of the system. Government did not have a comprehensive aviation policy till the draft policy was put in public domain only 4-6 weeks ago. ATF pricing is only one element. We have forgotten the fact that India has high operational costs on one side, and look at the paradox, and we have a highly price sensitive market. So unless you control the costs, you can't survive.
Okay.
Airlines, unfortunately, whether you call it amateurish, stupidity on our part, they went about chasing market share and offering seats at rates, at
so
fares,
what Mr.
below
Kaul
the
is saying.
cost
So
of
both-
producing a seat.
Right.
Now, if you continue to do so, the writing is on the wall.
Right.
And
Okay.
surprisingly, because it's an issue of policy I'm talking about, the government allowed them to do so.
Okay. So you're saying that's one area where the government ought to have intervened, which is to make sure that there was no
You see,
predatory.
what sensible governments would do is to learn lessons out of past experience. Kingfisher was a good learning ground, let me put it this way to you. Post Kingfisher's experience, a mechanism should have been put in place that the first time an airline defaults in making payments to the oil companies, aircraft leasing companies, airports, employees, government taxes not being submitted, etc., the mechanism should come in place of monitoring an airline finances. You can't allow an airline to keep selling tickets, and SpiceJet went to the extent of selling tickets in advance at ridiculously low fares for meeting their immediate cash flows.
Right. Okay. Mr. Kaul, so there was a reference made by Jitendra Bhargava here about the new civil aviation policy. Is that a solution? I mean, does that address some of the issues that you pointed out? For instance, the high fuel rates that Indian airlines pay, and is that the only reason, or is that the only major policy gap that needs to be filled?
No, not at all. Firstly, the new aviation policy is really no policy, just a bunch of points, and it misses out many things like safety, civil aviation authority, and so on. Anyhow, we don't want to go into the new civil aviation policy, which we don't consider it as a policy. Basic issue is that operational costs are high in India, but at the same time, airlines are in a way oligopolistic. They are trying to, they all have the same cost, and they are trying to beat each other by going at times very much below the operating costs, and on the other side the prices shoot up, and there is a need to look into the price management system, their computer systems which they are using to deploy to make the best profit, because they claim, and correctly also, that each seat is perishable and should be sold at whatever cost when the aircraft is taking off. But this is not yielding them profits, and there is something wrong basically. Taxes are very high, but they are common to all airlines.
Just one more, Mr. Kaul. So should we? I mean, if the government intervenes, the civil aviation regulator intervenes more proactively when it comes to pricing or setting of pricing. In as much as not setting the pricing in itself.
I'm not saying that by imagination. Monitoring only when an airline is in a crisis situation, otherwise a hands-off policy.
Okay.
Because we must recognize this fact, and as the past 20 years show very clearly, Government of India, the bureaucrats manning the civil aviation industry, lack the expertise as far as this sector is concerned. An unfortunate part is that Air India, which has been in the business for several decades, has failed to produce experts or leaders from within. As a consequence, private airlines, as we are all aware, most of them have been hiring expats to run their airlines. A clear indication that you don't have it. Now, when you neither have in the airlines and you are managing it in this manner, the aviation ministry has not thought of a comprehensive policy for all these years. Question is why? Did they lack the expertise, or was there lack of political will?
No, but what is this new policy going to address fundamentally?
No,
which
you
is
see,
different from
let me give you one example. The government allowed AirAsia India and Air Vistara last year. The current government has allowed 6 more airlines to come into the market. Imagine with the augmentation of the capacity in the market, you are bound to be witnessing a bloodbath as far as the fares and the finances of airlines are concerned. The new airlines will offer attractive, which means low fare, to passengers to garner market share. Other airlines will be compelled to match the fares. Now, what happens in that scenario? Who's responsible for it? So this aviation policy should not only be covering as I said, the capacity and demand equation that you must have. It can't be that I apply for an airline and you allow me to do it. Second, have we been reckless as far as allowing foreign airlines to dominate the international skies, being given away for sixth freedom traffic? Now, all these things shows lack of experience on the part of government, one. Number two, their protection to or desire to make Indian aviation industry a robust industry. Unless you have too many airlines, one is of course airlines which are economically sound, only then can they grow.
Right. Okay,
now
so
people haven't, no, just a minute, a very pertinent point. The short-sightedness is evident that you allow an agreement like the Jet Ethiraj to take place and give them 37,000 seats. Look at the consequences which haven't been highlighted. We have 6,000 pilots unemployed in this country. Now all this business that goes to them for Europe and European and US traffic from India, who orders the aircraft?
No, what's the policy response to that? I mean, that's
no, this is a policy. What I'm saying is that there are bilateral agreements which are laid out. All countries follow those agreements. Give them the third, fourth freedom traffic as much as they can, but don't give them sixth freedom. Now, whatever be the considerations of the political leadership, the fact is they've caused enormous damage to the Indian aviation. They are not in a position to grow the way they should have. And one startling example of this is Indigo is a profitable airline. Well-run airline. A question that needs to be asked is that though they've completed 5 years of minimum stipulation 3 years ago, why haven't they thought of flying to Europe or United States?
Okay, Mr. Kaul, let me come back to you. Last question. How do you see? 2015 is going to be an interesting year. There is going to be some economic growth. That's the general feeling, unless something seriously goes wrong at the global front. So, given all of this and yet more airlines coming in, what's your sense? What are the 2 or 3 key issues that need to be addressed if we are to bring the sector back to some health?
Well, there's going to be growth, definitely, and therefore, I think it's necessary that when air operators' license is renewed, the financial health of each airline has to be studied by DGCA before giving the annual approval. This is being done in other countries, and here, if an airline is losing money, is not doing well, the license need not be renewed or renewed under certain conditions. This is very important because recklessness in pricing of tickets is showing now in their financial health, and financial health of an airline becomes critical. We don't even know how much of safety issues are not followed properly, and that is also another aspect which needs consideration. A financially poor airline will try and camouflage certain safeties which are necessary to run it properly.
Okay, so monitor airlines more carefully or more more closely. Make sure that there is intervention sometimes when clearly competitive practices go out of control, and of course learn from the good examples that there are. We've run out of time, gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us. That's all we have time on Policy Watch this week. We'll be back next week, same time. Thanks for watching.